So the two categories of the fallacies of presumption and the fallacies of language constitute the last two categories of fallacies we're going to be looking at. Fortunately, there are only 5 total fallacies in both of these categories, so this review should go pretty quickly. We have 3 fallacies of presumption and 2 fallacies of language. So I'm not going to go over the details of the fallacies very much because there are so few of them, and I think the forms are pretty obvious, though as I go through the exercises I'm going to emphasize discussion of equivocation and amphibole. These two fallacies of language seem to give students difficulty distinguishing one from the other, although I think with a little bit of practice you'll see it should be pretty obvious how to separate one from the other. So the 3 fallacies of presumption, begging the question, complex question, and false dichotomy all share a simple basic feature, and that is that they presume the conclusion is true even before the argument takes place. In the case of begging the question, in fact, the conclusion is found within the premises. So you're basically arguing in a circle. It's like arguing that the sun is shining and your reason is that the sun is shining. So you're really not giving any evidence. You're just presuming that the conclusion is the case. In the complex question, similarly, what you have here is something that looks like a question, which of course is a way that we try to solicit information about the world, but in fact a complex question isn't actually a question, it's a disguised assertion. So it's presuming its own answer. Hence it goes into this category of fallacies of presumption. And in the fallacy of false dichotomy, you are falsely presented with 2 options as if those are your only options, and one of which I am presuming to be the favorable one. So I frame the issue as if that's the only real choice you have. So I'm presuming that it is the case that it's the right option for you. So those 3 fallacies are fairly easy and they have pretty clear structures, as we'll see as we go through the examples. Equivocation and amphibole are our fallacies of language. These both have to do with ambiguity. And the basic distinction is pretty simple. In equivocation, we have an error that is the result of ambiguity of a word that is used within the context of the argument, where we slide from one meaning to the other. Think about the word right, for example, the English word right, R-I-G-H-T. Well, it could mean a civil right. It could mean that you are correct. It could mean the direction right. As you can see, it has a variety of different meanings, and if we slip from one meaning to the other of that word, we're going to have problems in our argument. Amphiboles are also about ambiguity, but in an amphibole the thing is that it's not a single word that's causing the problem, but rather an entire phrase or an entire sentence or an entire statement that can be taken in more than one way, so we don't really know what it means. And of course, if we don't really know what it means, you could see that it's very easy to fall into error. So let's run through these exercises and see some of these issues, and I'll point out some additional factors as we encounter them, especially with equivocation and amphibole. The first of our fallacies of presumption was begging the question, or otherwise known as circular argument, where the conclusion of the argument is assumed within the premises. We have examples of this fallacy in number 1 and number 3 of the exercises. Number 1 says random drug testing in schools is very effective in reducing drug use because the regular use of testing makes drug use less likely. Well, these two statements really are synonymous, and the argument is basically that testing reduces drug use because testing reduces drug use. That's not really an argument, that's just an assertion without any justification whatsoever. Number 3 does exactly the same thing. It says people who lack humility have no sense of beauty, because if you'd have a sense of beauty, you would also have humility. Again, we're just going in a circle. So 1 and 3 are doing the same thing. Those are both begging the question. Number 2 is a different form of fallacy of presumption. This is the fallacy of false dichotomy, where you're presented with 2 alternatives. Either we sterilize third world people, or the world population will explode and we'll all die. This alternative is a false dichotomy because clearly more options are possible, but the issue is framed in this way because the person making the argument has a presumed favorite option, that because we don't want to die, therefore we must require forced sterilization. So this is an example where you're presented with two alternatives, one of which is the one I want you to pick. The other is presented in such a negative light that no one would ever pick it, and so you're psychologically forced towards my presumed favorite option. Number 4 is an example of the fallacy of equivocation, and it centers around the word ring, right? A ring can be a piece of jewelry, of course, that you wear on your finger, or you can give someone a ring, which is the way we used to say call someone up. I don't know if anyone uses that idiom anymore, but that used to be how we used to speak. So if Thomas gives Marie a ring, then Thomas and Marie will be engaged. Thomas did give Marie a ring. In fact, he phoned her just the other night. Therefore, Thomas and Marie are engaged. So here, the argument slides from, oh, he gave her a ring, that is, he called her, therefore they are engaged, because he gave her a piece of jewelry that is a ring. Obviously, we've slid meanings here. We've gone from one sense of ring to another, so that's an example of equivocation. Number 5 is an example of complex question, and these should be fairly easy to recognize with a little bit of practice. Alex, I heard your testimony in court earlier today. Tell me, why did you lie on the witness stand? Now that looks like a question, but it's not really a question because it's a disguised accusation that you did in fact lie on the witness stand, and it's asking why did you do that? So it's presuming that you did it rather than asking a legitimate question like did you do it or did you not do it? There you would have a choice that you could freely answer. Here the question as framed presumes its own answer. That makes it a complex question. So here in number 6, we have our first amphibole. It says, George said that he was interviewing for a job drilling oil wells in the supervisor's office. We could only conclude that the supervisor must have an awfully dirty office. Now the conclusion is drawn because the interpretation given to the claim drilling oil wells in the supervisor's office is taken to mean that the oil wells were actually being drilled within the physical space of the person's office. Rather, that is probably not what is meant, but the idea here is that George was interviewing for a job drilling oil wells, and the interview took place in the supervisor's office, not actually the drilling of the oil wells. So the entire phrase is ambiguous, and the conclusion that's drawn is mistaken because it's taking the statement in one sense when it was intended in the other. Number 7 is a clear example of a false dichotomy. Either marry me right now or I'm going to leave you, and of course the person doesn't want you to leave, and so therefore they're compelled to marry you because they view the situation as those are the only two options and one is undesirable, whereas there are probably other options that are available. 8 is a typical example of a circular argument or begging the question, where the structure is a little bit different, but the way to tell that it's begging the question is to look at the first statement, which is the conclusion. Picasso is the greatest artist of the 20th century. A bunch of other information and reasons are given, and then at the end you see that one of the reasons that he's the greatest artist of the 20th century is because he's the greatest artist of the 20th century. So even though other reasons are given, this still is threatened with circularity because the conclusion is found within the premises. This is not, in this particular case, absolutely devastating because we could probably rewrite this argument without that circular premise to make it a strong argument. But as it stands, because the premise and the conclusion are the same, it's a circular argument. 9 is an example of a complex question. Sylvia, are you still drinking excessively? Well, that presumes that she is, of course. So therefore, it's an example of a complex question. And then number 10 says, emeralds are seldom found in this country, so you should be careful not to misplace your emerald ring. The conclusion, of course, is because you're unlikely to find it. This would be an example of an equivocation. An equivocation, as I've been emphasizing, it's usually hinging on a single word, but it could also hinge on a very short phrase that's functioning as a single concept, like the idea of being seldom found. Well, that could mean once you lose it, you rarely find it, or just being rare. Emeralds are rare in this country, which is probably how it's intended in this particular argument. So 10 is an example of equivocating on the phrase seldom found. Number 11 says that Mr. Wilson said that on July 4th he went out on the veranda and watched the fireworks go up in his pajamas. We conclude that Mr. Wilson must have had an interesting evening. And the conclusion here follows by taking the initial premise to mean that he watched the fireworks literally go up the legs of his pajamas, let's say, which is probably not how this was intended. That is, it probably should be taken to mean that he was wearing his pajamas and he went out on the veranda and watched the fireworks go up. This is an example of an amphibole. The entire statement that he went out on the veranda and watched the fireworks go up in his pajamas is ambiguous. So that's what makes it an amphibole. 12 is an equivocation on the word nothing. A crust of bread is better than nothing. In other words, a crust of bread is better than no food at all, and nothing is better than true love, meaning true love is the best thing that could possibly be. These two senses of the word nothing are different, and therefore the conclusion that a crust of bread is better than true love does not follow. It's an example of equivocating, sliding from one meaning of nothing to another. 13 says that California condors are rapidly disappearing, that is, rapidly becoming extinct. And this bird is a California condor, therefore this bird should disappear any minute now. Well, in the conclusion, the sense of to disappear means to vanish from being visible, basically, to become invisible. And so therefore, clearly, those are two different meanings of the word to disappear, so therefore that's an equivocation. 14 is a pretty clear example of a false dichotomy, and 15 is an example of circular argument or begging the question. All of us cannot be loved because all of us cannot be the object of deep affection. Well, to be loved and to be the object of deep affection, those are synonymous expressions. They mean exactly the same thing. So 15 goes around in a circle and it's begging the question. In this group, we have a couple of examples of complex questions and some other fallacies that we're now pretty familiar with. 16 says, what did you use to wipe your fingerprints from the safe you robbed? Well, obviously that's not really a question because it presumes that you robbed the safe, and so that's not a legitimate question. Similarly, in 19, when are you going to stop talking nonsense presumes that you are talking nonsense. That's another example of a complex question. 17 says, Pauline said that after she had removed her new expensive bracelet from the box, she threw it in the trash. I guess Pauline doesn't like expensive bracelets. This is an amphibole because the phrase, she removed her new expensive bracelet from the box and then she threw it in the trash, is unclear. Did she throw the box in the trash or the bracelet in the trash? Hopefully she threw the box in the trash, but we can't really determine that, and the conclusion goes with the idea that she threw the bracelet in the trash. That's an amphibole. 18 is an example of equivocation, and here the ambiguous word is the word obtuse. Some triangles are obtuse, meaning they have an angle greater than 90 degrees. But the word obtuse can also mean ignorant, and that's what the second statement says. Whatever is obtuse is ignorant, and therefore some triangles are ignorant. Well, that literally makes no sense and can only be determined to follow if we change the meaning of obtuse from the first to the second meaning. So that's equivocation. And 20 is probably also best seen as an example of an equivocation. What goes up must come down, meaning whatever goes up in elevation will descend in elevation. And the price of food has been going up for years. Up is being used in one sense in the first statement and in another sense in the second statement, so that's a clear example of equivocation. Number 21 is an example of begging the question. Criminals are basically stupid because anyone who isn't stupid wouldn't be a criminal. Well, you're saying the same thing twice. That's a pretty clear example. 22 is an example of a false dichotomy. Either you're with us or you're with the terrorists. The choice should be easy. In other words, you should decide to be with us because otherwise you'll be branded a terrorist. Well, clearly there's more opportunities, more possibilities of choice than just those two options. So that's a false dichotomy. 23, I gave you my reason for what I did, but as usual, you failed to listen to reason, so you continue to fight me. So here we have an example of equivocation, and the word in question that's the problem here is the word reason. I gave you my reason, meaning I gave you my rationale, my excuse for what I did. And then in the second premise, we see that the phrase appears that you fail to listen to reason. Right? To listen to reason is to hear me out, to hear my argument. And so therefore we slide from one use of reason to the other, and that's an equivocation. 24 looks like another example of a circular argument. The reason everyone wants the new Tickle Me Elmo doll is because it's the hottest selling toy of the holiday season. But isn't that really just saying everybody wants it because it's popular, everybody wants it? That's not giving me a reason why everybody wants it. There's no real argument there, so that's begging the question. And 25 is another example of an equivocation, and here we're equivocating on the word law. There are laws of nature that science discovers, and by laws in that first statement we mean mathematically describable physical regularities. The second statement says a law implies a lawgiver. Here we're using the word law not in the sense of a law of nature, but rather in the sense of a civil law, like the laws that the court system enforces, for example. So the two senses of the word law are different, and the conclusion that therefore there must be a cosmic lawgiver doesn't follow, because even though there may be laws of nature, that doesn't mean that those kinds of laws require a lawgiver. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. That would be something to take up in another philosophy course, perhaps. So number 26 is, by now, hopefully an obvious example of a false dichotomy. Either you join our cause or you'll become a moral monster. Well, presumably there are other choices than just those two. So that's a false dichotomy. 27 is equivocating on the word miracle. Right? Miracle can mean, like in the first statement, miracles of modern science, meaning really amazing technological developments. That's a different sense of the word miracle when compared to the use of the word miracle in the context of religions or in the Bible, where you have, divine intervention into the physical sphere. So clearly we're equivocating on the word miracle. Miracle Whip salad dressing is not divinely inspired. There the word miracle is being used in a very different sense. I think you get the idea. 28 says, new housing development sign says, beautiful homes available immediately. Get there soon. They won't last long. This is an amphiboly. Amphiboles can sometimes be a little bit amusing. Sometimes they're charming. It says these beautiful homes are available. Get there soon. They won't last long. Does that mean that they're going to sell out really soon, or that they're going to fall apart very soon? They won't last very long, like a pair of shoes that doesn't last very long. That's a whole phrase that's ambiguous, and therefore that's an amphiboly. School isn't worthwhile because book learning doesn't pay off. This is a circular argument. It's basically saying that school isn't worthwhile because school isn't worthwhile. It doesn't pay off. Book learning is synonymous with going to school and learning from books rather than from experience. So basically we're arguing in a circle. 29 is begging the question. And 30 equivocates on the word run. We could run as in, walk very quickly, or run, like a runner, or to pass through something. Everything that runs has feet, and a river runs through the valley, so the river has feet. Well, no, because in that second sense, the word run is being used differently. This is an example of equivocation once again. 31 is another example of an amphiboly. Our mobile X-ray unit will give you an examination for tuberculosis and other diseases which you will receive free of charge. So why is this an amphiboly? Well, it could mean that the examination will be given free of charge, or tuberculosis and the other diseases will be given free of charge. So you can see that, it could be taken in more than one sense. It's an entire phrase which is ambiguous. That makes it an amphibole. 32 is clearly a complex question. Is George still telling lies? Well, that presumes that he does tell lies or has told lies. It's different than asking, does George tell lies, which is an actual question. This is a complex question. It presumes its own answer. When you play poker with pros, you need to either bet everything you have or quit and go home a loser. Well, I think there are other alternatives between betting everything and going home a loser. So that's a false dichotomy. 34 is a famous example of an amphibole from the ancient Greek historian Herodotus. He tells the story of Croesus, who goes to the oracle at Delphi to ask if he will be victorious in his military campaign against the Persians, and the oracle tells him that if he leads an army against the Persians, he would destroy a great empire. And so Croesus thought, oh, that means the oracle is telling me I'm going to win, I'm going to destroy a great empire, and so he attacked the Persians, and he lost, and his great empire was destroyed. The oracle at Delphi was notorious for being ambiguous, and this kind of amphibole is something that was often encountered when you went to try to get an oracle about the future. So that's an amphibole in 34. 35, why do you always wait until the last minute to prepare for class? Well, that presumes that I wait until the last minute to prepare for class, which may or may not be the case, but it's presuming that I do, so this is a fallacy of presumption, and it is a complex question. So in conclusion, I hope this review was helpful and shed a little bit more light, especially on the distinction between equivocation and amphibole, which I know from having done this a few times is a source of confusion, at least initially for students. But after a little bit of thought and reflection and a few practice examples, I think the distinction becomes clear. As always, of course, if you're not sure about anything, you can always post questions in the question forum, or you can send them directly to me by email. It's probably preferable to put them in the questions forum just because that means more people can see your question. And if you have a question, lots of people probably have the same question, and so if I can answer it, I help more than just one person. But if not, if you don't want to do that, I'm always happy to help you just by answering your emails. If you have any questions, let me know, and otherwise, good luck on this upcoming quiz on this topic.